I want to welcome you to DePaul University's Virtual Alumni College. Tonight we're fortunate to have Dr. Mary English Dixon, the J. Stanford Smith Professor of Economics and Management. For many of you, this is your first session of the Virtual Alumni College, so I want to make sure you're aware that we intend for these sessions to be interactive. You can pose a question to Dr. Dixon at any time by using the question feature in your toolbar. We'll also be trying out tonight a polling feature. Professor Dixon will be putting to all of the attendees a series of polling questions. I want to reassure you that your responses will be viewed only in aggregate. We'll not be looking at your individual answers or certainly grading you. You've received your DePaul degree and your grade point averages are fixed, so we'll not be changing those at this point. But with that settled, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Mary English Dixon. She's in her 25th year of teaching at DePaul, known to many alumni and students since 1988. She has served as the director of DePaul's McDermott Center for Management and Entrepreneurship, as Associate Dean of Academic Affairs, and in a recent faculty fellowship, she founded the Women in Economics and Business organization. So it's my pleasure to turn the program over to Dr. Dixon.
Good evening. I'm delighted to be here today. As Steve said, I've been at DePaul since 1988, and I want to thank the Alumni Office for asking me to speak tonight about something that's really important to me and something that I find very interesting. I hope the rest of you enjoy it as well. The talk tonight is titled The Federal Reserve's Historic Response to the 2008 Financial Crisis. And just as a little bit of background, I was a student of economics in the late 70s and early 80s when the Financial Deregulation and Monetary Control Act of 1980 was being discussed and was just introduced. So as I was coming through my undergraduate years, monetary policy was something that was written about a lot, was on the news a lot, and was something that I really was interested in. So I spent some time with a PhD dissertation on monetary theory, came to DePaul in '88 after witnessing the 1987 crash, and really have always been interested in the Federal Reserve and the Federal Reserve's response to crises. So what I want to talk about today is why the Federal Reserve's response to this crisis is historic. And I hope for those of you that have had senior seminar that you'll see a thesis statement and some evidence to support my thesis statement so that at the end of the session you can decide whether or not I have made the case for a historic response to the Fed. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to be using a pen-based tablet, so you might hear things like that, which are just me writing on my screen. So the first screen you should see is the graph. As you know, I always teach with lots of numbers and graphs, so my graph is the Fed's asset level from 2002 into 2013. And obviously there's a large run-up right here. So as you can see, this large run-up that started in late 2007 all the way through 2008, and that's the Fed's initial response to the crisis. So I want to talk about that run-up, that original run-up, and then I want to talk about this other new trend line starting from a much higher point and talk about why that is in fact historic. Now, one thing that you may not know is that the Fed's balance sheet has been something that's been in textbooks for years, something that we talk about, never been as sexy as it is right now. The Fed's balance sheet typically used to grow very slowly. It was about $800 billion before the crisis. It is now at $3.4 trillion, and that's been in 5 years. So that is a huge change, and I want to show you how we got there and then let you decide whether or not it's been worth it. So the crisis of 2007 started with the economy slowing, house prices were falling, and a realization that the subprime mortgages were deficient in underwriting and disclosure. There was, as Ben Bernanke says, the shadow banking sector, which was suffering serious credit losses. It was hard to define and determine what the size and scope of that loss would be. And there was a variety of asset prices which were falling, putting lots of pressure on balance sheets, not just at banks, but at other financial intermediaries. So Bernanke and others have characterized the crisis not as a run on deposits, but as a financial crisis, which was a run on uninsured wholesale banking, not this part of the shadow banking sector. And one of the first things we noticed right away was that short-term funding needs were not being met because there wasn't very much interbank lending. So firms and banks that had were accustomed to being able to go into a short-term credit market and either sell their commercial paper or their repurchase agreements, or if they had security lending, they weren't able to have anybody buy those credit assets. So the Fed was very concerned about this lack of liquidity in those markets. There was high leverage, there was inadequate risk management, and there was lots and lots of uncertainty about the nature and the foundation of these new things called derivatives that were mortgage-backed security, were based on mortgage-backed securities. So I'm going to try this new poll. I'm going to ask you whether or not the Fed should have acted. So given what you know about the 2007 situation, should the Fed have acted? Yes or no? So we're waiting for that, and so most of you have voted, and it's an overwhelming yes. We believe that the Fed has acted. So given that, I'm going to go ahead and show you what the Fed actually did. So the Fed's response to the financial crisis, I believe, was historic for several reasons. One, it was historic because they used traditional tools in new ways. The tool of lender of last resort, something that they use on a regular basis. They provide liquidity to banks, and that was something that they normally do, but they used them in new ways. So they offered their liquidity resources to non-bank intermediaries. So if you were a financial intermediary that needed liquidity, you could go to the Fed. They also use their interest rate target in a non-traditional way. We'll see that in a moment. And their communication tool, that's the tool of messaging and trying to get the economy to move just based on what the Federal Reserve says. So these are tools that they've had in their toolbox for a long time that they use regularly, but they were used in new ways, which makes that the use of those tools historic. Then there were new tools that were developed, something called currency swaps with other European banks, other central banks, including the European Central Bank. They had these new liquidity facilities providing liquidity to security dealers and others. And for the first time ever, there was a coordinated interest rate change from the United States Federal Reserve and a variety of global central banks. First time ever. Now, these historic responses, we'll see the effect of those. But one of the things that we're learning just now is that the financial crisis has already had some supply side effects, and monetary policy doesn't help supply side effects. So I want to talk at the end of our time about these permanent supply side effects that we're just now seeing. We see a reduction in the potential GDP. We see a decrease in the labor force participation rate and a decrease in the natural rate of unemployment. These are really troubling side effects, not of the Fed's response, but of the financial crisis as it started. So got a lot to do, and I hope that you'll ask me questions as you have them, and we'll have a few more polls, and I should be able to gauge a little bit about your feedback on this whole Fed response. Okay, so what are we going to do? Like any class, we have a plan, and here's my plan. Well, I'm going to describe the economic conditions. We're going to describe the Fed's response, paying attention to those responses that are traditional and non-traditional. We're going to talk about something called the zero bound. Maybe you've heard heard that term before. I'm going to look at why that's so important. And I'm going to define the difference between credit easing and quantitative easing. I'm going to look at that Fed balance sheet that I think is sexy now, that maybe hopefully by the end of this you'll think is sexy too. We'll have some discussion about whether the Fed's actions were necessary and did they help, and then move forward into the future about what we've learned from the recession and the Fed's response. So you ready? Okay. Lots of graphs. So here are prevailing economic conditions from January 95 through December of 09. You can see, if you use this official measure of the unemployment rate, very strong upward movements in the unemployment rate. No surprise, if you were around at all during that time, you remember it. You also remember that there was big dips in real GDP, mostly brought on by the deleveraging that occurred and a reduction in consumption. Consumption's our engine. 70% of our GDP is in consumption. Big decline in consumption, big decline in real GDP. So this has already been adjusted for price level changes. This is real output effects. To see that a little bit more clearly, you can see percentage change in real GDP. And again, we're talking about this time period where we had significant deflation. Now, for those of you that have been students any time before 2005, we talk a lot about the Fed preventing inflation. But the Fed is also really worried about deflation. And one of the things that they noticed in this, this downturn is the fact that prices were falling quite significantly. And that was a big concern for the Fed. And that was something that they wanted to make sure that they addressed right away. Because as prices change, as prices fall, profits fall. As profits fall, firms fall, and employment just gets worse. Well, what's going on with inflation? The CPI for all urban consumers, you can see here, is negative, so we see that prices overall were falling. And the Fed's target is 2%. So even now, with that run-up in the Fed's assets, we still don't see much difference in the inflation rate, still around the Fed target. Now, the Fed has a mandate, and it's a dual mandate. And the two things the Fed is tasked with is providing for maximum employment and price stability. This dual mandate has always been part of the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, but it was clarified with this amendment in 1977. So again, remember, I was a student in the late 70s and early 80s. This is something that was talked about, that was discussed, that was in the news, just like the Fed's response now is in the news. So the things that we learn at foundation times of our educational careers, I think stay with you, and I think that's why this is so interesting to me. And I hope that maybe you'll start to fall in love with some of the graphs that I'm going to show you. Just maybe you'll have a better understanding for why this is important. Okay, so beginning in 2007, unemployment was rising rapidly, output was falling, and prices were falling. That doesn't sound like the Fed is meeting their goals of maximum employment and price stability. Oh, so here we go. The Fed's initial response, the summer of 2007 through December of 2008, it served as the lender of last resort for banks. That's a traditional response. But it also offered the discount window, that's the window where banks can come and borrow from the Fed, to other financial intermediaries. So it offered loans not just to banks, but other financial intermediaries that needed liquidity. It approved currency swap arrangements with 14 central foreign banks in order to provide sufficient dollar liquidity abroad. They didn't want a dollar shortage abroad. And so 14 central banks agreed to have these temporary credit swaps. Those have now become permanent as of November 1. They provided additional liquidity to borrowers in these key markets, commercial paper, repurchase, things like that. Never before done. That's a non-traditional response. Normally, the Fed reduces interest rates to try and stimulate consumption and investment and get the economy moving. but had never before reduced interest rates to 0% for such an extended period of time. You'll see in a graph in just a moment that this federal funds rate, which is the overnight rate that banks lend excess reserves to each other, has been at the zero bound for a week, but never at this extended time. So that's a really historic change. And this original reduction of interest rates was a coordinated interest rate reduction that the U.S., the European Central Bank, Bank of England, and the central banks of Canada, Sweden, and Switzerland all agreed to, and that was different. So lots of traditional tools used in different ways. So the first way, again, traditional. Look what's happening to these loans. This is in millions, $450 billion worth of loans going out, not just to banks, but to other financial intermediaries. Here's our currency swaps, $583 billion of currency swaps during this really critical time, so providing lots of liquidity into the global market. Loans to primary security dealers. So dealers that provided, security dealers needed liquidity, and we saw that their balance sheets were in trouble because of the loss of value of their assets, and rather than having to call in loans to their clients, they were able to provide, the Fed was able to provide liquidity through this new liquidity facility. Okay, so now this is something you should probably have seen if you took money in banking or if you've had macro before. This is the federal funds rate from 1954 to the current time. When I was in school, this is what the federal funds rate was, way up near 20%. That was the time of Carter, and we had the misery index where we had unemployment was double digit and interest rates were double digit, and some of you may remember those times. But since that time, interest rates, the federal funds rate, has been quite low. And you can see where we're at right now, at 0. Here it is from 2000 to now. Again, here's that time period where it's at 0 for over 5 years. So what's going on? Here's the assets going up. Here's part of the assets. This is a currency swap. Those are the currency swaps. Currency itself, these are our dollars that are in circulation. Those aren't changing. That's still on its regular line. So we see that there's a huge run-up of assets. Our liabilities, which is currency, that's not changing. We've got loans to banks and other financial intermediaries. Those are going up, but it doesn't explain this big run-up here. But you do notice that banks have lots and lots of excess reserves. They're not lending. They're holding those excess reserves. They're afraid of what's happening in the future. They're not sure what their capital needs are going to be, and so they're holding onto those reserves, and they're not lending them out, and they're not trying to put them to productive uses. Well, you might say, well, the federal funds rate doesn't really apply to me because I'm not a bank and I don't borrow overnight, but the important thing to know is that interest rates move together. And so if you look at this kind of crazy looking graph, this is a graph of a variety of of assets that have different maturities and are different risk values, and you can see that they move together. And the federal funds rate is the one that's at the bottom. The overnight rate is the shortest duration. It should be at the bottom. You can also maybe see that as the federal funds rate falls, these other rates fall as well. And that's how the Fed typically initiates monetary policy. It increases reserves through the purchase of securities. As the reserves goes up, the overnight lending rate for those reserves, the federal funds rate, comes down, and other rates come down in turn. So here we are again, that federal funds rate at 0. A typical Fed response with a non-typical historic use. again. All right, so this graph, I hope, shows you how interest rates move in lockstep with the federal funds rate. This is the prime rate right here. And you can see how changes in the Federal Reserve, the Fed funds rate, changes that prime rate. But you can also see the yield on all industry AAA bonds are falling as this prime rate and as the Fed funds rate and as the Treasury rate falls. Those are all falling at the same time. Now, when we're at the zero bound, the Fed can't use its typical tool of open market operations. It can't buy and sell short-term Treasury bills to reduce the short-term interest rate. It's already at zero. So what does it do? Well, it uses another one of its tools called the communication tool. And Bernanke's been really clear about this. He wants to try and make the Fed more transparent. He wants to stop the Greenspan double talk and the obfuscation that he feels the previous Fed embarked on, and wants to make sure that he can share information and shape the public's expectations. So I don't know if you remember, but there was a 60 Minutes episode about Ben Bernanke just during this crisis, and they went down to South Carolina. They visited with his hometown. They saw where he lived above the grocery store that his parents owned, and it was kind of a feel-good story. Don't worry about the economy because Ben's got you, and he's just like you and me. He's from a small town. His parents were grocers. They're Main Street folk. So don't worry about things. Ben's got your back. Well, wouldn't you know, that wasn't enough. Unfortunately, the communication tool, while can move some of the markets, it just wasn't enough for this financial shock. And the Fed decided they needed to do more. Now, what the Fed decided to do was use a tool called credit easing. And Ben Bernanke was really specific about terming this tool credit easing, not quantitative easing. So credit easing is when the central bank buys assets in order to affect credit conditions in a very specific market. So it selects the mix of assets on purpose in order to affect the conditions in those markets. Quantitative easing, which the Bank of Japan did, is a run-up of Fed assets, but the mix of those assets is secondary. It's not targeted purchases. The effect of these decisions is the same. The Fed's balance sheet, or the central bank's balance sheet, increases. Here it is in Japan, and then below in the U.S. So you see the run-up. But if we look at the portfolio, that's where you see what the Fed decided to do. So remember, 2007, 2008, things were terrible. The housing market had absolutely tanked, and the Fed was really concerned about making sure that there was sufficient liquidity in the mortgage market. And so it decided to go into that market and buy mortgage-backed securities. So these were Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac agency-backed mortgage securities. It hadn't bought them before, and it went from 0 to 1.25 trillion. So that's a really big change, right? That's not like dipping your toe in the pool. That's jumping in with both feet, not testing the water, and not having a lifeguard on duty, right? That is just jumping in with both feet. And also bought $300 billion in Treasury securities and some more agency debt. And when that wasn't enough, then in November of 2010, it bought more longer-term Treasury securities, $75 billion a month. Now, remember I said that the Fed usually reduces the interest rates by pulling down the Fed funds rate. Well, if the Fed funds rate is already at 0, it can't pull rates down anymore through the Fed funds rate. So we've got these other interest rates that are higher, and in order to pull those down, it can't use this Fed funds rate. It has to push those rates down. And that's what they're doing. That's what the Fed is doing. It's affecting the interest rates with different maturity classes by going in and buying those securities. If the Fed buys those securities, the demand for those bonds goes up, the price of those bonds goes down, and their return, oh, excuse me, Mary, the price of those bonds don't go down, they go up, and the returns go down. Get so excited. So price goes up, return goes down, and that's what they're trying to do. Oh, wow. What is this? This is a graph of a variety of assets, and I just want you to look at some of these numbers. So the credit easing that started in 2008. Here's the Moody's AAA bond yield, a 20-year Treasury bond, and a 10-year Treasury. I could have had a 30-year Treasury, but believe it or not, I even thought that was too much on a graph. No, it's hard to believe. But here we've got the last day in October 2008, and you can see that rates, where rates are. They start to buy in December, and by the end of December, look what's happened to those rates. Look what's happened. 1.25 trillion in mortgage-backed securities. Now, I don't have mortgage-backed securities on here, but 1.25 trillion in that market leads to reduction in interest rates overall. We also see with credit easing too, November of 2010. So here we're here in August, rates start creeping up, and the Fed says, we don't like the fact that those rates are creeping up. We're going to go in and we're going to buy longer-term Treasury bonds, and look what happens. They start to come down. So the Fed is pushing down rates from above, from these markets, by actually going in to these markets and buying these markets. Remember, if demand for the bond goes up, the price of that bond goes up, and the return on that bond goes down, and that's what the Fed is doing. Now, Operation Twist, I really love. So Operation Twist, the Fed decided that it was going to substitute some of its shorter-term securities for longer-term securities because it still wanted to reduce the returns, the interest rates on those longer-term securities. And it's continuing that purchase right now, even though there's been some talk of taper, it's continuing to make those purchases. So here, without those other graphs, this is just the Fed's asset side of the balance sheet. We see the initial run up, and now we see credit easing 2, and then this part here is the Operation Twist, where we see the additions, the continued additions to the Fed's balance sheet. Now, the one thing I didn't have on that curve was this mortgage-backed security line. Remember I said that the first response was 1.25 trillion in mortgage-backed securities, so we can see that line here. Assets are running up, mortgage-backed securities go from 0 to some number. So let me pause here a minute and see if I can offer you another poll. So let's see, do you think that all of this money in the system will have helped? Did the Fed's response help? Oh my gosh, it's running neck and neck. Oh, the yeses are pulling away. Oh, get in your no vote if you think it's no, because the yeses are running away. It started 50-50. All right, time's up. 65% of you think it's yes, that the Fed's efforts have helped the economy. So let's take a look and see whether or not the Fed's response helped the economy. Well, we know that unemployment rates have fallen because that's in the news. And I showed you that inflation and inflation that inflation is still remaining low, and I can tell you that inflation expectations are remaining low. Outputs increased, but there's something called resource utilization, and that was really troubling, but it's been increasing. Investment remains depressed, and this is really interesting because at zero interest rates, or virtually zero, and of course if you're investing as a corporation in capital goods, you're not paying zero, but it's a historic low for interest rates. Investment demand still remains really low. And in macroeconomics, we often talk about a crowding out effect, where if the Treasury comes in and borrows more money, it increases the interest rate and crowds out private investment. So you wonder, well, if interest rates are so low, why is it that investment demand remains so depressed? Well, the Austrian school of economic thought says, hey, you know, uncertainty causes a crowding out effect. Because lots of firms are unsure about what's happening in the future, I'm not going to invest in a new computer system or a new production facility because I'm not quite sure what's going to happen in the future, and demand still seems to be a little suspect, so I'm just going to keep this cash on the sidelines and I'm not going to make any capital decisions. Okay, well that might be what's happening, but that's a real troubling situation, and I want to examine that in a little bit more detail. There's also an exchange rate effect. As interest rates fall, the dollar gets weaker, should stimulate exports, reduce imports. We have a loss of purchasing power, so I'm a little bit concerned about that, but the dollar's strengthened recently, and so there's a whole bunch of questions there. Now remember that the Fed had a dual mandate. One was to maintain price stability, and the other one was try to get maximum employment. It doesn't have an international component. So some are saying maybe the Fed doesn't care about international global markets. It does, and that's probably a whole another webinar, but there are lots of people who are quite concerned about what's going to happen as the money supply starts to grow. Right now it's not been growing. All that money's been kept on the sidelines. As the Fed begins to taper, what's going to happen in our international markets. Now, the thing that really makes me interested about this financial crisis is the fact that this demand-side financial crisis had supply-side effects. So the monetary policy can't affect supply-side concerns. Monetary policy can only affect demand side. So consumption, investment, expenditures can try and address those issues. Supply side effects are changes in our structure, changes in our labor supply function, changes in our productive capacity, changes in our technology structure. Those are supply side effects. And if this financial crisis has hurt our supply side, then our potential GDP will be diminished, our natural rate of unemployment might change, and our labor productivity will also be affected. And wouldn't you know, we're seeing signs of supply side effects. So in the next 10 minutes or so, I just want to talk about the Fed's response and these supply side effects. So here's our unemployment rate, which is about 7.2% is the official measure. However, the unofficial measure, the alternative measure, this is the U6 number, which measures both unemployed and looking for work, those that are employed part-time but would like to be working full-time, those who are discouraged and have left the labor force, and those who would like to work but haven't looked because they're just sure that there's no jobs left for them. That measure is closer to 14%. So our official measure at 7% may actually be quite underestimating the true unemployment number. So we have a lot of slack right now in our labor markets. Another really troubling number that maybe you've heard about is this labor force participation. So this is the percent of the labor force that's either working or looking for work. Now, We would expect with the socio-demographic changes over time that some of our workers would leave the workforce because of their age or family situations. We've got baby boomers, we've got people who leave because of their family situation. But workers of all ages are leaving prematurely as a result of this financial crisis. And more workers are discouraged. Look at this run-up of discouraged workers. Really troubling when you see this labor force participation and you see people leaving because they're discouraged. Okay, the inflation not changing very much, and that target of 2% pretty much being met, even though the Fed's balance sheet has increased 400%. 400% increase in the Fed balance sheet, and we don't even have inflation biting at all. I would have thought we had been Zimbabwe by now with multiple, 100% inflation with that kind of run up in the Fed asset side. We're not. Another measure that economists look at is the capacity utilization. So this is not just a labor number. This looks at all the capacity in our productive stream to see what percentage is being used currently. So this could be commercial square footage. This could be square footage in manufacturing, service areas, beds in hotels and things like that. And you can see through this crisis, our capacity utilization really went down. It's going back up again, but it looks like it's leveling off here. And it's leveling off at a level below our pre-crisis level. Some of those storefronts may never get full. Some of those beds may not be needed. So all of those things together suggest these supply side effects. Our potential GDP is the GDP that we would have if all of our resources were fully employed. That doesn't mean 100% of our workforce is working. We expect some unemployment, and that doesn't mean that all of our machines are working 24/7. We have some level of full employment for our machines too. They have to be repaired and they have to have some downtime. So it's not at 100%, but it's fully employed. And estimates now say that our potential GDP is 7% lower than our pre-crisis level. I have a job, but if I were coming out of college now and I knew that the potential GDP was going to be lower, I might be concerned. And as just a member of this economy, I want to see my economy grow, not shrink. So that's troubling. When you ask forecasters to provide an estimate for the growth rate of our potential GDP, the new estimates are down. They used to be in the 2% range, now they're in the 1% range. And I'm going to show you those in just a minute. Now, one of the things that you're probably going to hear about in the coming months is this new higher natural rate of unemployment, some new normal. So we're going to see evidence of hysteresis. This is a new permanent increase in the natural rate of unemployment, that level of unemployment where the economy tends towards when it's at its potential, when it's at full employment, when there's no cyclical unemployment. And new estimates for this natural rate are rising. And as we get more and more data, as we move away from the financial crisis, those estimates of that natural rate are going up. So as the new data comes in, we're showing more and more effects of this supply side ramifications from the crisis. There's also concern about increased uncertainty about the future, and uncertainty about the future inflation, and uncertainty about the financial stability. The Fed's response was historic. It went in and it bailed out non-bank financial intermediaries. Moral hazard is an issue, something that we're concerned about with banks. Are banks too big to fail? Now, do we have insurance companies that are too big to fail? Do we have mortgage companies that are too big to fail? Do we have securities dealers that are too big to fail? Who else might be too big to fail? Where's the contagion going to be next time? Why is it that we can have these financial intermediaries, the shadow banking sector, and not have sufficient supervision, and regulation. Where's the next bubble going to be? So there's all of this concern about the future. If you look at this real GDP, and had the crisis not happened, we might have been on that level of trend line. Here's our new real GDP. You can see right here that our trend line is different. And estimates, as I said, are up to 7% less than we were before. That's remarkable. There's a new paper out, Aggregate Supply in the United States, Recent Developments and Implications for the Conduct of Monetary Policy. It's on my bibliography page. It's a working paper that you can find at the federalreserve.gov. And in this paper, the authors do a variety of simulations and give different low growth, medium growth, and high growth scenarios for where potential GDP is. I'm not going to get into the specifics except to say that it's lower. And even in the best case, we're lower because we really did suffer from that financial crisis. There's things that we lost that we can't get back. And there's nothing that the Federal Reserve can do to get those things back. These are the estimates of potential GDP growth that I mentioned to you. And I think it's interesting to note that the growth rates were in the 2s in 2008, and here in the 2012, which were the latest numbers, they're all in the 1s except for the Council of Economic Advisors, and they might be a little bit biased just because of their job. I don't know, we'll leave that there just to show that that's a little bit of an outlier. But the IMF, the CBO, private macro advisors all have downgraded our potential growth in GDP. Now, I mentioned to you that investment demand was falling. And not only was investment demand falling, but the amount of capital that's actually in production, our capital stock is shrinking. And what we're seeing is that our output per unit of capital, so this is labor productivity using the capital that's available, has declined. It's coming back up, but it's still below pre-crisis levels. That means that workers are becoming less productive because they don't have the same availability, the same capital stock available to them. Maybe the machines are slower, maybe they're down for more repair, maybe they don't have as many, maybe they're older, they're not being updated. But that's troubling. When you try to estimate the natural rate of unemployment, which is a really important variable in macro models, there's always a range. So the range is between 4 and 6%, or 4.5% and 5.5%. What you can see here on this left is the red is the actual unemployment rate, and the blue is the average of this range for the estimate. And you can see that the actual unemployment rate is still well above the estimate of the natural rate, and the natural rate is growing, and the actual unemployment rate is still well above it. So there's still a lot of slack in the economy, even though the natural rate is growing. And the fact that the natural rate is growing, that's a change in the structure of our economy. That's a change that's going to go forward in the economy. That's not based on a nominal change of prices or something like that. That's an underlying structural change in our potential, in our capacity, and in the ability to produce goods and services. In part, it's due to this falling labor force participation rate. Some of it's due to that lack of capital. Now, the estimates for the natural rate of unemployment, this is getting pretty technical, but what I really just want you to see here is that when the natural rate of unemployment is estimated, and if you use 2008 data, so the estimates come in pretty reasonable. But the more data that's used, the higher the natural rate of unemployment estimates become. which means that instead of the economy getting better, the data that come in suggest that the economy is actually worse than it at first realized. So the more data you have, the higher those natural rate of unemployment numbers become. Curious. Another troubling statistic that points to our structural changes is the percent of the labor force that is what we call long-term unemployed for 26 weeks or more. So we tended around 1%, we got up to about 5%, and we're falling, but we're still 3% of our labor force has been unemployed for 26 weeks or more. And what's happening is that employers perceive the long-term unemployed to be less valuable because their skills have gotten rusty, or there must be something that they're missing because they've been unemployed for so long. And it's really hard for those long-term unemployed people to find jobs. Here's some data that show this. If you've only been unemployed for 1 to 26 weeks, 25% of those people who found a job were one of those more recently unemployed. About 12% of people who find jobs have been unemployed between 6 months and a year. And only 10% of the people who found jobs have been unemployed a year or more. So the longer you're unemployed, the more rusty you get with your skills, and the more perceived diminishment there is in your value to employers. So, what do we know? The Fed responded to the financial crisis as a lender of last resort. It reduced the federal funds rate to 0. It turned to credit or quantitative easing. And the financial crisis permanently affected the economy. There were supply side effects, which are going to have long-standing effects. And there's this increased uncertainty now about these very low interest rates, which might lead to more financial instability and, in fact, a second crisis, which could be worse than the first because of this response. So not to, cause a lot of alarm, but just to make you aware that the Fed's response was historic in the way they dealt with this financial crisis. Now, you might have questions about the future. We have a dual mandate. Should we adapt that dual mandate to include an international condition? Should we be concerned about the Fed's balance sheet? Certainly, interest rates are eventually going to go up, and then the value of those long-term bonds are going to fall. What happens then? Has the Fed added more financial instability? Has it created more moral hazard? Is there something that we should be doing to make the financial markets more stable? Yeah, maybe. Now, some people have talked about eliminating the Fed. Let's go ahead and see what you guys think about that. Should the Fed be eliminated?